The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Gwen Tully almost didn't answer it. She was elbow-deep in a sink full of cold water and soap suds, her apron still on, her feet aching from 10 hours of standing on industrial tile. The phone buzzed against the metal prep counter, and she glanced at the screen. Unknown number, Chicago area code, and almost let it go to voicemail. She had leftover enchiladas waiting. She had a hot shower and 8 hours of sleep waiting. She had a life that was small and manageable and entirely hers, and she had learned at 31 years old that unknown numbers rarely brought anything worth interrupting enchiladas for. She answered it anyway. "Is this Gwen Tully?" The voice was male, clipped, not unkind. Professional in the way that expensive things were professional, smooth and certain of its own value. Depends on who's asking. A pause. Then, "My name is Harlan Reed. I represent Callaway Sinclair Group. We need someone with your particular background at our offices tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. The compensation for a single day's consultation would be," he named a number. Gwen set down the dish she was holding. "I'm sorry," she said. "Can you say that again?" He said it again. She untied her apron with her free hand. "I'll be there at 7:30. She hadn't always worked in a hospital cafeteria. That was the part people assumed, that she'd always been there, that the hairnet and the steam trays and the laminated menu board above her station were the whole of her, the beginning and end of her story. Patients who came through the line barely looked at her, doctors especially. She'd once watched a thoracic surgeon spend 45 seconds explaining what a whole grain was to his luncheon companion, while she stood 6 inches away, having quietly swapped out his usual high-sodium soup without being asked, based on nothing, except having read his chart summary when it came through the dietary system 3 days before. He hadn't noticed. He never did. What she was, underneath the apron and the practical shoes, was the kind of person who read things. Contracts, mostly. Also case law. Also 3 languages she'd picked up through a combination of stubbornness and insomnia, a translation dictionary, and the public library's audiobook collection. Her mother had called it a waste of time. Her ex-boyfriend had called it showing off. Her supervisor at the cafeteria, a quiet woman named Mrs. Pacheco, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had seen everything twice, had once leaned across the pass-through and said, very quietly, "Baby, you are too sharp for this kitchen." Gwen had smiled and handed over a tray of butternut squash. She hadn't disagreed. Callaway Sinclair Group occupied the top 4 floors of a building on Wacker Drive that was all glass and cold geometry. The lobby had marble floors so shiny Gwen could see herself in them, which she tried not to think about too hard. The reflection showing a big woman in a navy blazer she'd bought 6 years ago for a job interview she hadn't gotten, her dark natural hair pinned up, because it was the only way she knew how to tell it to behave. She'd ironed her slacks twice the night before. She was carrying a tote bag from a library book fair. The receptionist looked at her. The security guard looked at her. A man in a tailored suit waiting by the elevator looked at her, and then looked away. The way people looked away when they'd assessed something and found it not worth further attention. She gave her name at the desk. The receptionist's eyes flicked to her screen, then back to Gwen, something shifting in her expression. Recalibration, faint surprise. "Mr. Sinclair's assistant will be right down." Gwen waited. She read the plaques on the wall. She noted the exit routes. She catalogued the tension in the lobby. People moving quickly, voices low. The particular hum of an organization that was currently not fine, but was working very hard to appear fine. She'd grown up in a house where something was always not fine, and you learned to read those frequencies early. The elevator doors opened. A young man in his 20s, visibly sleep-deprived, hurried across the marble. "Mrs. Tully, I'm Elliot, Mr. Sinclair's assistant. Thank you so much for coming. It's a complicated morning." He was already moving back toward the elevator. "If you'll follow me." She followed. On the 38th floor, the complicated morning announced itself immediately. 3 separate conversations were happening at once in the glass-walled conference room, all of them in different languages. A man was on the phone in the corner, pacing, speaking rapid French with the clipped precision of someone who had learned it in boardrooms rather than classrooms. Two women at the far end of the table were going over documents in what Gwen identified, after a moment, as Portuguese. And in the center of the room, a man stood with his back to her, hands braced on the conference table, head down, the way people stood when they were trying very hard not to come apart. He was tall, dark-haired, beginning to show silver at the temples, broad shoulders in a charcoal suit that had probably cost more than Gwen made in a month. There was something rigid about the set of his spine, controlled rather than calm, the difference between a person who was composed and a person who had forced themselves into composure and was holding it there through sheer will. When he turned around, she placed him immediately, not because she'd met him, she hadn't, but because his face had been in the business section of the Tribune twice in the last year. Callaway Sinclair, international real estate, acquisition deals across Europe and Southeast Asia, a recent bid on a development corridor in Lisbon that had gone sideways in some way the articles had been carefully vague about. His name was Bennett Sinclair. He was 43, according to the profile she'd read. He looked 43 the way people looked their age when the last few months had added something extra. He looked at her. She could see him doing the same thing the receptionist had done, the assessment, the recalibration, except his happened faster and landed differently. Not dismissal. Something more like exhaustion mixed with desperate hope, which was an uncomfortable combination to have directed at you by a stranger. "You're Tully," he said. Not a question. "I am. Harlan said you studied contract law at DePaul. I studied contract law for 2 years at DePaul before I had to leave. Then I studied it on my own for 9 more. He said, "You speak French, Portuguese, and Mandarin, functional Spanish, conversational Japanese." She set her tote bag down on the nearest chair. He also said the compensation for today would be substantial, but he didn't mention what the situation actually was. So why don't you tell me that part? Bennett Sinclair looked at her for another moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, and something in the controlled rigidity of his posture finally, marginally, loosened. "Sit down, Miss Tully," he said. "This is going to take a while." The short version. Callaway Sinclair was 22 hours away from the closing of a 9-figure development deal that had taken 3 years to structure. The deal involved 4 parties across 3 continents. The primary legal liaison, a man named Harlow, who had apparently been with the firm for 16 years, spoke 6 languages, and had the institutional knowledge of the entire transaction in his head like a filing cabinet, had been in a car accident on the Kennedy the previous evening. He was alive. He was also in a medically induced coma with 2 broken vertebrae, and his files, his notes, the parallel sets of documents that only he fully understood, were scattered across a system that no one else in the firm had complete access to or complete context for. The deal was closing tomorrow. If it didn't close tomorrow, the window expired. The French consortium, represented by the pacing man in the corner, whose name was Edouard, would walk. The Portuguese investors, the 2 women with the documents, had a board meeting in Lisbon on Thursday that would redirect their capital, and the Singaporean group, joining by video in 6 hours, had made clear through their representatives that they did not negotiate extensions. "What we need," Bennett said, "is someone who can read these documents. All of them, in all the versions, find the inconsistencies between what Harlow was tracking and what the current draft says, and help us course correct before tomorrow morning. The closing attorney will handle the legal execution. We need the translation, the context, and he paused. Harlan called it pattern recognition. He said, "That's what you do." Edouard had stopped pacing and was now standing in the doorway to the conference room, looking at Gwen with an expression she recognized. She'd been receiving variations of that expression her entire professional life. It said, "This is the person they found?" Gwen looked back at him pleasantly. Then she looked at Bennett. "Pull up the master document set," she said. "And get me coffee. Real coffee, not whatever's in that machine. The next 6 hours were the most interesting 6 hours Gwen had spent since she'd walked out of DePaul, with her life rearranged around a financial shortfall and a sick parent, and the dawning realization that the path she'd planned for herself had closed off without ceremony or apology. She'd had 9 years since then to decide whether that was the end of her story or just a diversion in it. She'd mostly decided it was a diversion. Days like this were how she knew she was right. The documents were a disaster. Not a catastrophic disaster, more the kind of accumulating, layered disaster that happened when one person had been holding too many threads for too long, and then suddenly wasn't there to hold them. There were terminologic inconsistencies between the French version of the asset transfer clause and the English master. There was a liability cap in the Portuguese addendum that didn't match the figures in the Singaporean rider, a discrepancy of just under $4 million that had apparently been caught by Harlow and notated in a shorthand only he used, and which the junior associate who'd tried to decode it that morning had misread entirely and nearly papered over, in a way that would have voided the indemnification clause on page 47. Gwen found that one first. She set down her coffee, pulled the Portuguese addendum toward her, compared it to the English master, then picked up a pen and started writing. Edouard, who had been standing at the window with his arms crossed, turned around. "You found something. The liability cap in your addendum reads 4.2 million, she said in French, without looking up. The master reads 4.6. Harlow caught it. See this notation here, the asterisk with the arrow, but whoever was trying to decode his notes this morning read his shorthand for reconcile with Singapore as resolved. It's not resolved. If you close on this tomorrow with this discrepancy, your client is on the hook for the difference. Silence. She looked up. Edouard was staring at her, not with the expression he'd had in the doorway, with something else entirely. Bennett, from the other end of the table, was completely still. "How long did it take you to find that?" he asked. 20 minutes, there are probably more." She went back to the documents. "Let me keep going. There were more. Not disasters, most of them. Small misalignments, terminological drift between drafts, the kind of thing that would have been caught in a standard review, but hadn't been because the standard review had been Harlow, and Harlow was currently unconscious on the 3rd floor of Northwestern Memorial. But there was one more significant issue buried in the Singaporean rider, a force majeure clause that had been revised in the most recent version in a way that subtly, very subtly, shifted the risk allocation in a manner that Gwen suspected had not been agreed upon by all parties. She called the Singaporean representatives before their scheduled video call. "I want to flag something before we get on the formal call," she said. In Mandarin, "I'm reviewing the rider on behalf of Callaway Sinclair, and I noticed the revision to Section 12. I want to make sure we're aligned before we get into the closing meeting, because I think this might represent a change from the agreed framework, and I'd rather surface it now than interrupt the closing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, in Mandarin, "Who are you?" "My name is Gwen Tully. I'm a contract specialist." Another pause. Then, with something that sounded like cautious respect, "We'll discuss it on the call." They did discuss it on the call. It took 40 minutes and required Gwen to simultaneously translate a side conversation between Edouard and the lead Portuguese investor, track the Singaporean group's position in real time, and cross-reference 3 separate document versions while Bennett sat at the head of the table, maintaining the composure of a man who had chosen to bet everything on someone he'd met 4 hours ago. The force majeure clause was revised. The liability cap was reconciled. The Singaporean group agreed to the corrected terms. At 6:14 p.m., Edouard Marchais, who had over the doorway to the table to a chair directly adjacent to Gwen's, sat back in his chair and said, in French, quietly as though to himself, "Formidable." Gwen capped her pen. "Thank you," she said, also in French, and had the minor satisfaction of watching him realize she'd understood every word he'd muttered to himself all day. The offices had mostly emptied by 7. The Portuguese investors had left for their hotel. The Singaporean call had ended. Edward had shaken Gwen's hand with both of his, a gesture she suspected he did not deploy frequently, and said something about the closing the following morning and how he hoped she would be present. She was packing up her tote bag. Her library book was still in there, undisturbed. The enchiladas she hadn't eaten the night before were still in her refrigerator. She had work at the cafeteria at 6 a.m. Thursday. Miss Tully. Bennett Sinclair was standing in the doorway of the conference room. His jacket was off. His sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked like a man who had been in crisis all day and was now, slowly, emerging from it the way you emerged from cold water. Blinking, uncertain of the solidity of the ground. "You're leaving." "I have work tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment. "Where do you work?" She considered not answering. Then, "St. Agatha's, the cafeteria." Something moved through his expression. Not pity. She'd become expert at identifying pity and bracing for it. This was something different. More like the particular surprise of finding something where you hadn't thought to look. "You do this." He gestured at the table, at the scattered documents, at the entire day. "And you work in a hospital cafeteria." "I do this when someone calls me," she said. "The rest of the time I make very good turkey chili and watch over people's sodium intake without their knowledge." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but she caught it. "I'd like to call you again," he said, "if that's all right." She looked at him. At the conference table still covered in documents. At the Chicago skyline going dark and golden outside the floor-to-ceiling glass. The city laid out below them like something belonging to someone else. How much was that liability discrepancy worth if it had closed without correction? She asked. He told her. She nodded, once, the way she nodded when a number made sense. "Your rate for future calls should reflect that." "Name it," he said. She named it. He didn't blink. "Done." She picked up her tote bag. "Then yes, Mr. Sinclair, you can call me again." She was at the elevator when she heard him behind her, not chasing, just walking, the unhurried walk of a man who had learned that urgency was best saved for when it mattered. "Harlan said he found you through a law professor at DePaul," Bennett said. "Someone who remembered you." She pressed the elevator button. "Professor Aldana. I took his contract theory seminar in second year. He was probably the best instructor I've ever had." A pause. "He gave me a 96 on my final exam, and then spent 20 minutes explaining what I'd gotten wrong on the other 4 points. What elevator doors opened? She stepped in, turned around, held the doors with one hand. "Nothing," she said. "He just wanted to see how I'd argue." The doors closed. In the elevator mirror, she could see herself. The library tote, the 6-year-old blazer, the hair coming loose from its pins from a long day of work. She looked, she supposed, exactly like what she was. A woman who had taken the long way around. A woman who had spent 9 years getting somewhere on a path that shouldn't have worked, using tools that shouldn't have been enough. She thought about the liability clause, about Edward's face, about Bennett Sinclair at the head of a table, choosing to trust her. She looked pretty good, actually, all things considered. The closing happened the following morning. At 9 a.m. Gwen was there. She had called into the cafeteria, apologized to Mrs. Pacheco, listened to Mrs. Pacheco say, "Baby, I told you," in a tone that contained no actual surprise, and worn the same blazer because it was the only blazer she had, and it was fine. It was more than fine, it fit her, and she'd pressed it. And she was done apologizing for what she looked like in the rooms she walked into. Edward nodded to her when she came in. The Portuguese investors, Senora Alves and her associate, had apparently asked Harlan Reed that morning whether Mrs. Tully would be attending. The Singaporean team lead on video from his office in Singapore said in careful, formal English that he appreciated the professionalism of Callaway Sinclair's team in the pre-call review, and Gwen, sitting 3 chairs down from Bennett, chose not to correct the attribution. The closing took 4 hours. 3 times, something came up that required translation. Once, a terminology question arose about the French version of a subclause that the closing attorney wasn't certain of, and Gwen answered it without looking up from the document she was reviewing. Twice, she passed notes down the table to Bennett, small, neat handwritten observations, phrased as questions, that he read without expression, and then used quietly, without making a thing of where they'd come from. At 1:07 p.m. the documents were signed. He'd apparently had brought up, without telling anyone. It felt planned and spontaneous at the same time, the way good theatre did. Someone handed Gwen a glass. She thought about the 9 years, about the sink full of dishes, about the unknown number she'd almost let go to voicemail, about all the times she'd been in rooms like this one. Not this one, but rooms like it, hospitals and waiting rooms and offices, and been invisible in them, necessary and invisible, her intelligence a private fact that other people occasionally stumbled across and were surprised by, as though they'd moved a piece of furniture and found something valuable underneath. She raised her glass. Bennett Sinclair, from across the table, caught her eye. He raised his. The champagne was excellent. She would have expected nothing less. She got a call 3 weeks later. Then a month after that. Then, in what became a pattern without either of them formally declaring it to be one. Regularly, Wednesdays, mostly, sometimes Fridays, always with real problems attached, the kind that required someone who could read a contract in 4 languages and then explain in plain English what it actually meant and what you should do about it. She raised her rate twice in 8 months. He paid it both times without discussion. In October, she ran into Dr. Farris in the hallway outside the cafeteria, the thoracic surgeon, the one with the proof. He was on his phone, barely looking where he was going, and he nearly walked into her. He apologized absently, the way people apologized to furniture, and kept walking. She watched him go. Then she went back behind the counter, swapped his usual soup for the lower sodium option, and took a call from a number she now recognized immediately. "I need you Thursday," Bennett said, without preamble. "Zurich." She looked at the steam tray, at the laminated menu board, at the long line of lunch-hour traffic starting to build toward her station. "I'll need a direct flight," she said, "and real coffee, not whatever the hotel has." She could hear him almost smile. She'd gotten good at hearing it. "Done," he said. "And Gwen." She waited. "Bring a second blazer." She looked down at herself, at the apron, the practical shoes, the hairnet she'd forgotten she was still wearing. "I'll think about it," she said, and started ladling soup.